I'm 68 years old, and I need you to listen carefully for a minute. The most dangerous habit in America isn't smoking anymore. It isn't drinking. It isn't bad food. It's believing you still have time. That belief almost destroyed my entire life. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly. That's how it happens for most people. You keep telling yourself you'll slow down later. You'll call more often later. You'll finally live later. Meanwhile, your life keeps moving without you. I know because I did this for decades. And the worst part is, people praised me for it. They called me responsible, reliable, hardworking. I believe them too. At 46 years old, I was exactly the kind of man society admires. Steady job, good income, never complained, always busy. I hadn't taken a real vacation in 11 years. Back then, I was proud of that. Now, it sounds insane to me, but when you're trapped inside that kind of life, you stop noticing what's disappearing. And before you tell yourself this only happens to older people, let me ask you something honestly. How many times have you said these words recently? Things will calm down next month. I'll make time after this project. I'm just trying to get through this year. Maybe you've said those exact things. Most people have. That's the trap. You think you're postponing stress, but many times you're postponing your entire life. I didn't understand that until one rainy Tuesday afternoon. One phone call changed the way I see time forever. Even now, 22 years later, I still hear my sister's voice sometimes. But before I tell you what she said, you need to understand who I was back then. Because if you had met me at 46, you probably would have respected me. Most people did. I worked for a logistics company outside Chicago. Nothing glamorous, nothing exciting, but stable. I'd spent almost 20 years there. By then, people depended on me constantly. Managers trusted me with major accounts. Co-workers came to me with problems. New hires copied my routines. And honestly, I built my entire identity around being needed. I was the first car in the parking lot most mornings, usually before sunrise, and most nights. Mine was the last office light still on. I wore exhaustion like a badge of honor. Back then, I thought burnout meant importance. Maybe you think that too. Maybe part of you believes your value comes from how much you sacrifice. I definitely did. I had a wife, 2 kids, a decent house in the suburbs. On paper, everything looked fine. Actually, more than fine. People used words like solid, dependable, successful. I remember hearing those words constantly. And every time somebody said them, I felt temporary relief, like maybe all the stress was worth something. But here's what nobody tells you about that kind of life. You can look completely successful from the outside, while slowly disappearing on the inside. That's exactly what happened to me. It happened gradually, slow enough that I barely noticed. That's why this kind of thing is dangerous. If your life collapsed suddenly, you'd react immediately. But when it fades quietly, you adapt to the numbness. You normalize it. At 46, my entire life ran on routines. Wake up before dawn, coffee, traffic, meetings, phone calls, deadlines, drive home exhausted, eat late, fall asleep in front of the television, then do it again tomorrow, and tomorrow after that. Weeks blurred together. Sometimes entire seasons disappeared before I noticed. One day it was spring, then suddenly Christmas decorations were everywhere again. That scared me even back then. Not enough to change, but enough to notice. My wife noticed too. She used to ask me simple questions at dinner. How was your day? Did you call your mother back? Are you listening to me? Most nights, I wasn't really there. Physically, yes. Emotionally, no. My mind was always somewhere else. Thinking about budgets, thinking about clients, thinking about numbers. Always tomorrow, never today. And here's the strange part. I truly believed I was being a good man. That's what makes these kinds of lives so tragic. The people inside them usually have good intentions. I wasn't chasing yachts or mansions. I was chasing security, safety, stability, a better future for my family. That's how men like me justify everything. We call it sacrifice. We tell ourselves we're protecting the people we love. But sometimes if we're honest. Work becomes a hiding place too. Because being present is harder than being busy. Busy gives you an excuse. Presence forces you to notice things. Your kids getting older, your marriage changing, your parents slowing down. Busy people can avoid those feelings for years. I know because I did. I missed little moments constantly back then. Not because I didn't care, because I thought there would always be more time later. That sentence ruined more of my life than anything else ever did. There's always later. I said it constantly. My son asked me to go fishing one Saturday morning. I told him I couldn't. Quarterly reports were due Monday. He said, okay. Kids stop asking eventually. Nobody warns you about that part. You think they'll wait forever. They won't. My daughter used to sit beside me on the couch sometimes, just talking about school. Half the time, I barely heard her. I'd nod while staring at emails on my laptop. One night, she finally said, Dad, you never really listen anymore. That sentence stayed with me for years. Not enough to change immediately, but enough to hurt. And still, I kept going. Because life rewards people like that at first. The harder I worked, the more successful I appeared. Bigger bonuses, more responsibility, more praise. But every improvement created another problem afterward. We bought a larger house, then worried about larger payments. I got promoted, then worked even longer hours. We earned more money, then somehow needed more money. The finish line kept moving. You probably know that feeling. Maybe you've lived it yourself. You finally reach one goal, and almost immediately another one replaces it. That cycle can eat entire decades of your life. I had a friend named Gary who lived exactly that way. Good man, hard-working, sharp mind, the kind of person everybody admired professionally. One night after work, we sat at a bar near the office. He looked exhausted. I remember him staring into his drink and saying, I just need 10 more good years. 10 more years working nonstop. Then he'd travel, relax, spend time with family. That was his plan. Most people have some version of that plan. Maybe you do too. The problem is, life doesn't care about your timeline. Nobody explained that to us when we were younger. Or maybe they did. Maybe we just didn't listen. At 46, though, I still believed hard work could control everything. I thought if I planned carefully enough, saved enough money, stayed disciplined enough, eventually life would reward me with peace. Then came that Tuesday afternoon. Cold rain outside. Gray sky. Traffic backed up for miles. I was standing outside a conference room holding a presentation folder. Regional executives were flying in. Big meeting. Weeks of preparation. I remember checking my watch repeatedly. I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Then my phone rang. I looked down and saw my sister's name. And honestly, my first instinct was to ignore it. I almost sent her to voicemail. That decision still haunts me, because for one brief second, I chose another meeting over my own family. Again, but something made me answer anyway. And the moment I heard her breathing, I knew something was terribly wrong. She sounded fragile, small somehow, like fear had emptied everything out of her voice. Then she said 6 words, and suddenly every single thing I thought mattered stopped mattering at all. She collapsed in the bathroom this morning. That's what my sister said. Then she went quiet for a second, and after that silence, she said something that still follows me today. She kept asking for you. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I remember the conference room door opening behind me. I remember hearing people laugh inside. I remember somebody asking if I was ready. But suddenly none of it sounded real anymore. The meeting I'd stressed about for weeks became meaningless in less than 10 seconds. That realization scared me later, because if something can lose all meaning instantly, maybe it never mattered as much as you believe. I walked through the parking garage in a daze. Cold rain outside, gray sky, traffic everywhere. I sat in my car for almost a minute without moving, just staring through the windshield. And one thought kept repeating in my head. I should have visited Sunday. My mother had called earlier that week, 3 times. I answered once, told her work was hectic, said I'd stop by soon. Soon. That word sounds harmless when you're younger. Later in life, you realize soon has buried entire relationships. Maybe you know that feeling already. Maybe there's someone waiting for your call right now. Maybe you've been meaning to visit somebody for months. Most people don't think these moments matter much until one day they become the moments keeping you awake at night. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Traffic lights, brake lights, rain sliding down the windshield slowly. I kept looking around at other drivers, people drinking coffee, talking on phones, looking frustrated. Everybody rushing somewhere important, or at least somewhere they believed was important. That's the strange thing about adulthood. You can spend decades chasing urgency without ever questioning whether the urgency is real. I know I did. At 46, I thought stress meant purpose. The more overwhelmed I felt, the more valuable I believed I was. Maybe you've told yourself that too. A lot of men do. We confuse exhaustion with meaning. We confuse sacrifice with love. And sometimes we hide inside work because work feels simpler than relationships. Relationships ask things from you: attention, patience, presence. Work mostly asks for time, and time becomes easier to give away than emotion. I didn't understand that back then. All I knew was how to stay busy. That was my talent: staying occupied, staying distracted, staying important enough to avoid looking too closely at my own life. By the time I reached the hospital, my stomach felt tight. My sister was sitting near the entrance alone. The moment she stood up, I knew things were worse than she admitted over the phone. Fear changes people physically. It drains color from their faces somehow. She hugged me immediately, longer than normal. Families communicate terrible news silently before words even begin. She told me our mother was stable for now. Stable. Doctors say that word carefully. Families hear it desperately. I walked into that hospital room terrified. But honestly, fear wasn't the strongest emotion I felt. Shame was, because deep down, I already knew the truth. I had been slowly disappearing from my mother's life for years. Not intentionally, quietly. That's how these things happen. You miss one dinner, then another. Then a birthday call becomes shorter. Then visits become occasional. And because nobody screams about it, you assume everything's still fine. That's the danger of emotional neglect. It rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It just slowly becomes normal. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. That hit me immediately. Parents stay frozen in your memory for years. Strong, capable, permanent somehow. Then one day you notice time has been touching them too. Her hands trembled slightly. Her breathing sounded uneven. Her hair looked almost completely gray. And suddenly I realized something deeply painful. She had been aging quietly while I answered emails, year after year. I knew client schedules better than her medication routine. I knew quarterly projections better than her doctor's name. Sitting there beside that hospital bed, I realized something humiliating about myself. I had spent years being available to everybody except the people I loved most. That truth cut deeper than fear ever could. Because fear fades eventually. Regret doesn't. I sat beside her most of that night, machines humming softly nearby, rain tapping against the windows, nurses moving through hallways quietly. And for the first time in years, I had nowhere else to be. That should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt uncomfortable. I kept reaching for my phone automatically, checking messages, checking emails, checking work updates nobody would remember a month later. Even then, that disturbed me more than anything else, because I realized my mind had been trained to avoid stillness completely. Maybe yours has too. Most people can't sit quietly anymore. Silence becomes unbearable once you've spent years avoiding yourself. Busy people rarely stop moving long enough to ask difficult questions. Questions like, what exactly am I building toward? How many years am I trading away for approval? How much of my life am I postponing until later? Those questions started following me everywhere after that night. And once awareness enters your life, your old routines start feeling unbearable. That's the problem with clarity. Once you see the truth, you can't comfortably return to pretending anymore. Around midnight, my mother woke up fully for a few minutes. She looked confused at first. Then she saw me sitting beside her, and she smiled immediately. That almost broke me. Not because she blamed me, because she didn't. She squeezed my hand softly and asked, "Did you leave work early?" Imagine that. A woman lying in a hospital bed, still worried about inconveniencing her son. I told her none of that mattered. But even as I said those words, I knew my actions had been saying the opposite for years. People believe your patterns more than your promises. That sentence changed me permanently because suddenly I started remembering things differently. Little moments mostly. My mother waiting outside school during snowstorms, packing lunches before sunrise, driving across town after exhausting shifts, ordinary acts of love, the kind you barely notice while they're happening. Then one day, they become priceless memories. And sitting there beside her bed, I saw the imbalance clearly. She had given me decades of attention. I had given her leftover time, leftover energy, leftover presence. That realization haunted me long after she came home. Because once you notice emotional absence, you start seeing it everywhere. At family dinners, inside marriages, between parents and children, people sitting together physically while mentally living somewhere else entirely. Maybe you've experienced that too. Maybe somebody you love has already noticed your absence before you did. That thought frightened me deeply. And honestly, things became worse after the hospital at first, not better, because awareness creates discomfort before it creates change. People love inspirational stories because transformation sounds clean and immediate. Real change feels uglier than that. Confusing, embarrassing, slow. Part of me wanted to return immediately to old routines. That's what humans do. We crave familiarity, even when familiarity is quietly destroying us. But something had shifted permanently inside me already. I noticed time differently afterward. That's hard to explain unless you've experienced it yourself. The world looked identical, but suddenly I could feel life moving. I noticed older couples sitting silently in restaurants. I noticed empty chairs during holidays. I noticed men my age wandering grocery stores alone at night. And I started realizing something uncomfortable. Most loneliness doesn't arrive suddenly. It accumulates quietly through years of emotional postponing. One distracted conversation at a time. One missed dinner at a time. One delayed visit at a time. Until eventually distance becomes normal. Nobody wakes up intending to lose connection with their family. It happens gradually through attention drifting elsewhere for too long. That terrified me because I could suddenly see my future clearly. A respectable career, financial stability, and relationships weakened by years I could never recover. Let me tell you something painful. Your company replaces your role quickly. Your family remembers your absence for decades. I wish somebody had forced me to understand that earlier. Maybe somebody tried. Maybe I was too distracted to listen. A few weeks after the hospital, I found an old voicemail from my mother accidentally. She'd left it months earlier. Nothing dramatic, just checking in, asking if I was eating properly, laughing softly about making too much soup again. At the end, she said something simple. Call me when life slows down. I sat there staring at my phone afterward, because suddenly I realized something devastating. Life was never going to slow down on its own, not automatically. The finish line kept moving every year. More work, more responsibilities, more reasons to delay living. And meanwhile, time kept taking things quietly in the background. My son stopped asking me fishing eventually. My daughter stopped telling me stories about school. My wife learned how to eat dinner without waiting for me. And somehow I kept calling all of this temporary. Just another busy season. Funny phrase. Some people spend 40 years inside temporary seasons. Then suddenly, they're old enough to wonder where their lives went. One evening after work, I sat alone inside my car for almost an hour. Parking lot nearly empty. Engine off. Dark outside. And for the first time in my adult life, I admitted something terrifying to myself. I wasn't afraid of dying anymore. I was afraid I had been absent from my own life for years already. And that realization led me to the single most painful truth I've ever faced. The most painful realization came later. Not in the hospital, not during the phone call, not even during those long nights afterward. It came quietly one evening at home. I was sitting in the living room alone. Television on, volume low, house completely silent. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. The people I loved had already learned how to live without me. Not because they stopped loving me, because I had trained them to expect my absence. That realization broke something inside me. My wife no longer looked disappointed when I worked late. She looked accustomed to it. My children no longer asked whether I was coming. They assumed I probably wasn't. That's the part nobody warns you about. Relationships do not usually collapse dramatically. They fade through repetition. Miss enough dinners. Eventually, they stop setting your place automatically. Ignore enough conversations. Eventually, people stop bringing you their inner world. Keep postponing presence. Eventually, your absence becomes normal. And normal is dangerous because normal feels safe while it's destroying something quietly. I think about that often now. How many people are sitting in homes tonight, believing everything is fine because nobody is arguing anymore? Not realizing silence can also mean surrender. That thought stayed with me for months. And once I saw it clearly, I started noticing the same pattern everywhere. Older men eating alone in diners. Couples sitting across from each other without speaking. Adult children calling out of obligation instead of closeness. Everybody looking functional. Everybody quietly lonely. I used to believe loneliness came from being alone. Now, I think many people become lonely long before solitude arrives. They become emotionally unreachable first. That was happening to me. And honestly, I came frighteningly close to losing things I thought would always wait. That is the illusion adulthood sells you. You think love stays frozen. You think family remains available indefinitely. You think there will always be another Christmas, another Sunday dinner, another ordinary afternoon together. Then one day you realize life does not store moments for later use. If you miss them, they are gone. That truth changed me more than fear ever did. Fear fades. Mortality becomes abstract again after enough time passes. But regret behaves differently. Regret sits quietly beside you for years. At red lights, at funerals, in empty rooms after everyone leaves. And the worst regrets are never about money. Not once in my life have I laid awake regretting overtime budgets. I never lost sleep over old presentations. Those things disappear surprisingly fast. What stays are smaller things. The drive I never took with my father. The stories I rushed my mother through. The years I spent physically home, while mentally somewhere else entirely. Those are the things that remain. People think regret arrives loudly. Usually it arrives gently. You hear a song, smell familiar perfume, find an old voicemail unexpectedly, and suddenly an entire version of your life returns for a moment, then disappears again. That kind of pain is difficult to explain unless you've lived long enough. One afternoon, maybe a year after the hospital, I found myself staring at my son across a restaurant table. He was taller, older looking, more reserved than before. And during that lunch, I realized I had missed the transition completely. I did not notice when he stopped becoming a child. It happened while I was busy. That realization crushed me. Because there is no way to replay those years. No amount of success buys them back. That's the brutal part about time. Once it leaves, it does not negotiate. You cannot earn another childhood. You cannot purchase one more ordinary evening with someone already gone. You cannot ask life to pause while you finish being busy. And still, most people live as if those things are renewable. I did too. For most of my adult life, I kept believing I was building a future. What I was actually doing was spinning the present. The life you keep postponing is the only life you get. That sentence sounds obvious now, but I did not understand it at 35 or 45. Maybe part of me did not want to, because once you truly understand time, your priorities become impossible to defend. You start asking uncomfortable questions. Why am I giving strangers my best energy? Why do the people I love receive whatever remains afterward? Why do I treat deadlines like emergencies? But relationships like permanent fixtures? Nobody likes those questions. especially people who built identities around being productive. I know I hated them at first because they forced me to confront something humiliating. I had spent years confusing usefulness with love. Being needed at work made me feel valuable. But being valued professionally is not the same as being deeply known personally. That distinction took me decades to understand, and by then, some damage had already been done. Some parts of life do not wait patiently for you. They expire quietly. Children grow older. Parents grow weaker. Marriages grow colder, not suddenly, gradually, one postponement at a time. That is why I tell people this now. Not to sound wise, not to sound dramatic, because I know how easy it is to miss your own life while trying to manage it. And if you're not careful, you wake up one morning surrounded by achievements and starving for connection. I have seen that happen too many times. Men retire successfully, then realize nobody really knows them anymore. Parents spend 20 years providing, too, then wonder why conversations with their children feel distant. Couples spend decades surviving together without truly seeing each other anymore. Those outcomes rarely begin with cruelty. They begin with distraction, with postponement, with the belief that there will always be more time later. That belief nearly took everything meaningful from me. And the frightening part is, society rewards it constantly. People applaud exhaustion. They admire overcommitment. They call absent fathers dedicated providers. They praise people for ignoring their own lives gracefully. I know because they praise me too. Meanwhile, the people who love me most were quietly learning not to expect me emotionally anymore. That sentence still hurts to say out loud because it's true, and truth becomes heavier with age, especially the truths you discover late. My mother died 4 years after that hospital stay. Not suddenly, slowly, which in some ways was harder. You watch time working in front of you. You notice smaller steps, longer pauses, more fatigue in the eyes. And during those years, I began visiting constantly, not out of guilt anymore, out of understanding. We had simple afternoons together, coffee, television reruns, stories I'd heard before. And strangely, those became some of the richest moments of my life. Not exciting moments, not impressive ones, just real ones. That's another thing age teaches you. The moments that matter most rarely look important while they're happening. Nobody realizes they are inside the good old days at the time. You only recognize them after they're gone. That realization alone should change how people live, but usually it doesn't, at least not immediately. Human beings are excellent at pretending time is unlimited, especially when life feels routine. But routine can be dangerous. Routine hides endings. One day your parents pick you up for the last time. One day your child asks you to play for the last time. One day your spouse reaches for your hand for the last ordinary time. And most of us never notice those moments while they're happening. We assume there will be another opportunity later. That assumption destroys people quietly. Right now, someone you love is slowly becoming a memory. And you still think you have time. That may be the hardest truth I know, because I believed the same thing for most of my life. I believed there would always be another visit, another summer, another conversation. Then time began removing possibilities, one by one. That is what aging really is. Not wrinkles, not gray hair. It is watching options disappear, watching people disappear, watching entire chapters close permanently, and eventually understanding how much of life was temporary all along. That realization can make people bitter or awake. For me, it finally woke me up. I began saying no more often. No to unnecessary obligations. No to people demanding constant access. No to the endless race that never truly ends. And slowly, my life became quieter. Not emptier, quieter. There is a difference. I started noticing mornings again. Started listening instead of waiting to respond. Started treating ordinary time like something sacred instead of disposable. Because ordinary time is your life, not vacations, not milestones, not retirement someday. Tuesday afternoons matter. Dinner conversations matter. Phone calls matter. Presence matters. That is what remains in the end. Not the image you built, the moments you inhabited. And if I could leave you with one truth tonight, it would be this. Do not wait for loss to teach you what matters. Learn it while people are still here. Learn it while your body still moves well. Learn it while somebody still answers when you call. Because later is not guaranteed. Later is a gamble. And life rarely warns you before collecting the debt. I still think about that rainy Tuesday sometimes. About the conference room waiting behind me. About how close I came to ignoring that phone call completely. If I had. I honestly do not know who I would have become afterward. Maybe someone colder, more successful perhaps, more emotionally absent certainly. Instead, that moment forced me to see my life honestly. Painful as that was, I am grateful for it now, because clarity arrived before everything disappeared entirely. Not everybody gets that chance. Some people realize the truth standing beside coffins. Some realize it after divorce papers. Some realize it sitting alone in retirement homes, surrounded by years they can never revisit. I was fortunate enough to wake up earlier than that, late, but not too late. And if any part of this story felt painfully familiar, maybe that feeling exists for a reason. Maybe there is still something important waiting for your attention, someone important waiting for your time. If so, do not postpone your life again tomorrow. And if you'd like to hear more reflections like this, you can stay a while. Maybe subscribe. Maybe come back for the next conversation. There are things people our age should say out loud more often, especially before time quietly takes the chance away.